I really appreciated his analysis of the church because it was what I experienced myself growing up, and this is Du Bois really in his young adulthood going to study these things and experiencing them, but writing things down and deciding to publish his sociological analysis of what's going on.
We all are born in the society, we learn in the society, then we grow in the society, and it is a good thing that before we die, we leave something in the society. So by saying that, I'm trying to understand who could have been the major influence on Du Bois? Who did he learn from? Who were teaching him?
And I said it would have been better if Du Bois tried to develop some type of methodology to look at ourselves and look at the African world culturally and try to write unifying history, because all histories are political, and he was clearly making the case for the great achievements of African people and the pride that people of African descent should have in those achievements, as well as Pan-African unity.
Hi, I'm Obehi Ewanfo, the author of the storytelling series for small businesses and content creators. In Obehi Podcast, we talk about the power of your story, your narrative, and why you should own your voice. Whether you are a small business owner, a content entrepreneur, or you simply want to build your influence, storytelling is probably going to be your best instrument to connect with your audience. So join the awakened few who are owning their voices. Now let's get started with today's episode.
Well, first I want to say thank you for having me on your show again. My name is Dr. Taharka Adé. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at San Diego State University. And I have written this text on W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois' Africa, Scrambling for a New Africa, of which we're here to talk about today.
You see, that is really very interesting, Dr. Taharka, is that if you are looking at the African history today, it appears as if everything is turning back again to an argument that you can actually describe as a new scrambling for Africa. It appears that a war is about to take place in West Africa. We don't know yet what is going to be the result of that war. Then you look at all around, really, it's an argument that is very relevant today, which is the discussion of scrambling for Africa. How I would like us to start the conversation is why? Why did you decide to write this particular book? Let's start from there.
Well, it actually is a very long story, and I actually kind of go over it to some degree in the preface of this text, which it just starts with really me being introduced to Du Bois in a way that was kind of, it was through the academy, but just a slight bit outside of the academy. And I say it that way because I was introduced to Du Bois very early on, in grade school and everything. But as a Pan-Africanist scholar, I was introduced to Du Bois by way of a very good friend and mentor of mine, handing me a DVD called A Great and Mighty Walk, John Henry Clarke, A Great and Mighty Walk. And Dr. Clarke in that interview that he does, it's a documentary on his life and his life's work. He talks about Du Bois as the foremost Pan-Africanist scholar and thinker and philosopher. And I had never really known Du Bois to be associated with that before then. I knew he was, the person for A Talented Tenth and The Soul of Black Folk and double consciousness, that theory. But I never really understood him as, foremost a Pan-Africanist thinker. And that wasn't by, I discovered later, any real gaps in the knowledge of my professors. It was just really a gap in, the type of information that we were given on Du Bois, which largely largely centered around his earlier years in academia, and his back and forth with Booker T. Washington.
Thank you so much for that. That is really interesting. Yeah, of course, Du Bois is a prominent African American historian, a prominent African diaspora expert, and a figure actually in that sense. In that he's a type of person a lot of people look up to in the African diaspora community. Of course, I know that he's no longer there today, but of course, the work that he have, the footprint that he have left behind, the work that he have done, are still available for us to be able to examine. In fact, that is actually one of the most beautiful things about the documented history, that even though the person is not here, what he or she has done or has said, we still have them to be able to examine and know what kind of people they were. It gives us a kind of a window to be able to understand them. Within the preliminary of the argument, how did you feel writing this book? I mean, how was it for you putting this work together? But for now, it's available on Amazon. Of course, before we finish, we're going to let people know how they can get it so that at least they need to read it and they need to open up the conversation. They need to say what they feel about it. But first, how did you feel about it, writing this book?
Well, and to actually complete your question, your first question, when I got to grad school, so this book actually started off as part of a bunch of research when I was in graduate school. And when I got to grad school, I had focused on Du Bois quite a bit, but I wanted to shift my focus to Marcus Garvey, and that ended up being, a whole other thing. But I some kind of way found myself back into looking at Du Bois. I had a little book called The World in Africa that Du Bois wrote in around 47, 48 or so. And I had actually brought that book with me almost everywhere. It even traveled with me to Egypt, to as far as Luxor, Egypt and back. And so around 2016, 2017 or so, I started looking at this book again. And I started to think, there is an approach to African history that Du Bois is trying to do that I think it's good, but I think it's based on a paradigm that he himself warned us about, which was the racial paradigm. And I said it would have been better if Du Bois tried to develop some type of methodology to look at ourselves and look at the African world culturally and try to write unifying history, because all histories are political, and he was clearly making the case for the great achievements of African people and the pride that people of African descent should have in those achievements, as well as Pan-African unity. So and I just thought it would be better in that way. And so it began as a research question, really, at that time. And then it developed and developed and developed. And a good portion of this text ended up as part of my dissertation. And then I took it and worked on it some more over the years, took a bunch of things out, added some chapters. And by the time we got to the point of publication, it was, of course, had been a project of 4 or 5 years or more, just in terms of the research and putting it together. But again, my engagement with Du Bois has been well over a decade.
That's very interesting. So you do have a lot of material about him, and of course, you do have your observation, your critique of him. That will lead me to what is your take, or what are your major critique of his approach to African history?
Well, as I said, he himself sort of warns or gives some insight into why you really shouldn't uh, be so heavily focused on race. You know, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, right? And then he talks about race in one of his essays, stating that the it's really diminishing people to their skin color and hair texture. And within that same vein, he starts to talk about the things that bring people together culturally, really, and to be considered a people on cultural terms. But I was noticing in the book that Du Bois was still falling into some of those racial patterns. He was doing things such as trying to include Dravidians as African people, people of southern India, based off of skin color and hair texture, and this really, dubious thing that was being done in his time, where scientists, if you can call them that, were taking skulls and trying to, determine the race, quote unquote, of individuals based off of their skull shape.
But even the question of race itself is something that is not well understood, at least by a lot of people. In that we're
Mm,
trying to understand, and when we talk of race, are we really looking at it as a scientific explanation, or is it a political construct? So
mm.
when you say Du Bois is looking at the race, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that in the sense that what do we need to understand about the question of race? I know this is something that is very active in the United States, but also in other part of the West. Because of course, if you go to Africa, there's something that is less pronounced. We are not really that much into race and racism, because of
Mm,
course it doesn't mean that you don't have those bad behavior again. If I remember, for example, there was a time when Nigeria government decided to evict many Ghanaians that were in Nigeria, so they tagged it Ghana must go. If Nigeria were European, or they were white as so called, and the Ghanaian were the color that they are, that will of course be qualified as a racist agenda, as it were.
mhm,
Then of course many other incidents have happened in Africa. Look at, for example, the case of Hutu and Tutsis. If the Hutus were white and the other one were black, of course this will easily be classified as a racial situation. So for us in Africa, it's not something that we'll have other ways of understanding our differences and all that. So looking at the United States now, of course, you're looking at the presence of people of African descent and people of European descent who prefer to call themselves white, and the people of Africa as black. So it's highly pronounced, the question of race there. So I don't know what you want to say about that in terms of what we can learn from Du Bois' approach to racial argument.
Well, a few things there. I think that the examples you gave maybe need to have just a little bit more context to it. When it comes to the notion of race and animosities and xenophobia and that kind of thing with race involved, it also, you have to include the conversation of power and the historical context of how uh, power has been, used to exploit, as well as to dominate, and to also destroy the lives of people, just because of the color of their skin, but also because of their culture and all those kinds of things. But when you talk about the situation in Nigeria with the Ghanaians, yes, you could perhaps easily say that, oh, okay, well, if the Nigerians were white, it would easily be classified as a racial issue. But I don't think it's as simple as that. I think the notion of race itself, um, well, let me say, I don't think it's as simple as that, but it could also be, and I'll get to that in a second. But the notion of race itself is usually this power dynamic between those who, and since you're talking about people from two different nationalities outside of the Western context, I would just say in a larger scale, you're looking at it in a larger scale, it's power dynamics between people who, of course, have historically held power over another. And I don't know if you can exactly say that about that situation, even though it was to some degree power dynamics involved. So there's a lot of overlap. But what I would say there is, more xenophobia and that kind of thing is what's going on and what's driving that. Not the same type of historical animosity that goes into the notion of race. But there could be some overlap with that thing, with the historical animosity that goes into the notion of race, because even those of us in the African world have adopted some, racial attitudes towards those who look like us, right? And so, and I'm not certain, at all if that played into it at all, but I wouldn't be surprised if that has some small part in it. These are people who, yes, they look like us, but they come from this different country, et cetera, et cetera. And the things that by the British or whoever that have been placed on us in terms of imbibing racial attitudes towards ourselves and how we look at ourselves, and that self-hatred that comes out of that could have been then projected in that manner as well. So it's a very complicated, interesting thing that social scientists wrestle with and people in the humanities wrestle with a lot. It isn't so simple as you can, change someone's skin color and then it right there, it's a racial issue. It's I don't think it is. The other thing about race is that our concept of race is a very new concept of identities for people. That doesn't mean that something corresponding with the notion of race didn't exist even in the ancient world. I mean, the reason why you have the term Ethiopia, land of the burnt faces, is because, you're making a distinction. The Greeks are making the distinction between people who live south of ancient Egypt or Kemet. So, and that these are distinctions of separate groups and or races of people. But race in this more modern concept kind of stemmed out of a similar type of ideological background, but there was a time period where one would say something, one in the Western world would say something like the French race or the German race. And I think somewhere along the line, somewhere along the way, during the period of enslavement and how, race began to become more constructed around this notion of skin color, things of that nature, you started to develop these ideas of race that we have today. And in some ways, maybe a little less sophisticated than even how, it was considered in the ancient world, because it is, it's very, very surface in terms of, okay, this person looked this way, and so that's what they are. And but there's some underlining things, and this is why, although I used it earlier, the phrase just because of the color of your skin, there's some underlining things there that people don't also consider, which is people don't consider necessarily someone's culture when they're thinking about race, not always. And sometimes when they are talking about it, they try to make those two things the same, race and culture, which there's a lot of overlap, but it's not exactly the same thing. So, for example, Homer Plessy, in the famous case in the United States, Plessy versus Ferguson, he boards a train and he sits in a whites-only car on a train. And no one notices that this person is quote unquote Negro, as he would have been called, or as people were called, because ostensibly this is a white man sitting in a train car in that's where he belongs. It wasn't until he himself notified people who were, walking the train and conducting the business they were conducting on the train. So he notified them, I'm a Negro. It's when he was arrested and start the famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that led to the laws of separate but equal in the United States, right? And so clearly, ostensibly, this looks like a white man, right? But the moment he identifies himself as a Negro, then it's a problem. So if race is just skin color and hair texture, then why now is it a problem that this person he looks white, but he's quote unquote a Negro? And so clearly it's more than just skin color and hair texture, not race itself, but the racial antagonism is based on people's cultural background and cultural heritage, because it had to be in that person's mind who seized him and had him arrested that that this person is an inherent danger here, and he comes with a whole host of cultural background that the people in that train feel threatened by or not in favor of. So it's a very, very complicated thing, this notion of race, and particularly when you're talking about culture and how that coincides with it.
Thank you so much for that. That is really very interesting, very important, because I've always looked at the question of race as too superficial to really describe the complexity of the human being. I really don't ascribe a lot of cultural relevance to it, because when you say, of course, I know that, of course, a lot of research has been done that didn't prove anything. Like, for example, when a lot of Europeans started to take scholars from Africa to study, to say, okay, you are the actual Negro. Of course, they said it with the purpose of denigration, not because they really wanted to study for evidence. The evidence they needed or they were looking for were to prove that being Negro was negative. It was everything that explained negativity. Of course, they couldn't prove this. So today, or in the recent years, I think that people, when they talk of race or talk of the different races, or in this case, of course, the one that come out often is the white race and the black race. And it become natural to ask, but black and white are not the only people in this world. So if we have to classify people on the basis of race, why are we limiting it to, or why is it more popular to just talk about black and white? How do we call the Chinese? Okay, those are the yellow people. But where the Chinese and the Africans and the Europeans are not the only people in this world. What do we call the Middle Eastern? So the question of color as a code of classification in terms of the human being, I think have been faulty from day one. Didn't really explain it enough. Because I think if you call somebody black or white, it might describe how you look, but it doesn't really say who you are. Because who you are need to be explained in terms of your history. Where are you coming from? What is your background? And I don't think when European scholars were actually looking at the question of Negro in the sense of void, the sense of nothing, because they really look at it as an emptiness, a nothingness, they were really looking at the culture. They were just looking at the superficiality of how we appear to them, how they see us. Because if they look at the culture, then they could see what we have done. When you take a case to court, evidence will say whether that case is there or not. There are a lot of evidence everywhere. Even those of them that were going, they see that there were a lot of evidence, but they were not interested in the evidence. They were not interested in the culture of Africa. They were interested in the superficiality, how we appear. Anyway, thank you for that. I think it's an argument that I really would like to take on with you, maybe on another day, but of course, today we are talking about your book. So I don't know if Du Bois did say anything that we could reference in terms of race, in terms of a strong opinion in race, whether looking at it scientifically or looking at it as a social construction, a political construction. Is there anything we can say of him relating to race, as it were?
Well, I mean, it was Du Bois who said that race is the relegating of people to their skin color and hair texture. That it was, oversimplification. And, in his most famous line, of course, or in this regard, uh, in the American, imagination is, or the American remembrance of Du Bois is the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Um, in that he's talking about race, the problem of how people are going to get over this problem that is race. And Du Bois wrote quite a bit on that, quite a bit on what race is and who people are, particularly Black people. He dealt with it very heavily in The Soul of Black Folk, in other writings of our Negro strivings, quite a few things that Du Bois wrote, and especially very early in his career, was centered around this notion of the color line and race.
Thank you so much for that. Of course, those who want to learn more, they need to take up the book and read. It's available on Amazon. I want to repeat that again. All right. Society is very organic. It's a living thing. It's a living entity in this sense, in that we all are born in the society, we learn in the society, then we grow in the society, and it is a good thing that before we die, we leave something in the society. So by saying that, I'm trying to understand who could have been the major influence on Du Bois. Who did he learn from? Who were teaching him?
One major influence, I would say, was Alexander Crummell. Crummell was a minister and he actually trained at Cambridge. I think he was the first of African descent to train at Cambridge, later moved to Liberia, but he developed some very early Pan-African philosophy. And it was a significant influence on Du Bois. Du Bois talked and wrote about him.
All right, that's interesting.
Mm.
You did mention in the book the relationship between Du Bois and the Black Church, and I think this is going to be very important now for people that are reading, particularly for African diaspora, and of course even the Africans in Africa. The Africans in Africa are also invited to read about Du Bois, because Du Bois is a name that is very popular among many Africans. You know now, of course, leading to the independence in the system. A lot of Africa that go to the United States, they read a lot. Of course, they were there to study, so they have to read a lot, like Marcus Garvey and things relating to those time, to be able for them to be able to make their case when they return home. So the influence that they left is such that those are also pick up after them and read some of those things that they too have read. So names like Du Bois come up often among the African discourse. So yes, they too are invited to read this work. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that in terms of his relationship with the Black church or with the African American churches.
Well, Du Bois was very much influenced by very early in his life. He was his home church was visited by, I believe it was the Hampton Quartet. And he said it was so beautiful, it moved him to tears to hear the songs that they were singing, and he wanted to have more of a relationship with his African heritage. I mean, he grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which was pretty lily white. There was some Black people, and there was actually a small African Methodist church that was founded there, AME Church. African Methodist Episcopal Church, that was founded there, that he discusses in his autobiographies, that he and his mother visited a few times. But Du Bois, he really wanted to go to Harvard initially. And he ended up at Harvard eventually, but the kind of, I won't say sidetrack, but where he ended up first, because it wasn't a sidetrack, it was very, very foundational to who he became. Where he ended up first was Fisk in Tennessee. And he goes to Fisk, and he's involved in the church, And Du Bois gets very upset because someone in the church at Fisk told him that he shouldn't dance, that he and the other young congregants were being heathenish, essentially, by dancing in the way that they were dancing in the church. And he became very bitter with the church and the Black church specifically after that. But he wrote about it quite a bit, and he talks about the significance, the great significance that Black women in the Black church have on the institution, and I tend to agree with him that it is, if he can talk about a soul of Black folk, the soul of the Black church are Black women, and any Black church I've ever gone to, no matter the denomination, they're the soul of that institution. And Du Bois, talks about this quite a bit. Even the church I grew up in at home, that was very much so part and parcel of that church. And they made sure, for me personally, that I was endowed with, great morals, great ethics, and a, beautiful type of spirituality. I tend to tell people I get my sense of spirituality from my grandmother and my great aunt, who passed away 14 years ago this year. But I really appreciated his analysis of the church, because it was what I experienced myself growing up, and this is Du Bois really in his young adulthood going to study these things and experiencing them, but writing things down and deciding to publish his sociological analysis of what's going on.
I was sort of curious, in terms of your research, if there were, I don't know, institution or books or places that you went to visit that sort of became sort of eye-opener for you. Sometimes when you are embarking on research, you have an idea of what you want to do. Then you don't know everything that you're going to encounter yet. Otherwise, you already have all the information. So you go there maybe to pick a book or to speak to somebody. Then at the point wow, I didn't thought of this, something like that. I don't know if that was new information that you got that will reveal to you in the course of your research that sort of taught you in a certain way that you want to share with us.
Well, I would say the Charles Blockson collection at Temple University is a Charles Blockson Afro-American history collection. It was invaluable to be able to go into there, and a significant amount of information is stored there, and things that, very rare finds that you wouldn't find in just, of course, any normal library. And so I would spend, hours, looking through some of the stuff in that collection and get inspired by quite a few things in there. And I'm trying to think of just other places. Sometimes in the course of, just me traveling while I was in grad school, I would stop by, local libraries in different cities that I stopped in, and, look at different books and things. Another resource that before I even got to grad school, and it wasn't, really heavy in terms of, my principal scholarship, especially towards this book, but grounded me quite a bit, was when I was a student at Alabama State University, and the library there and the people who worked in the archive, they were pretty invaluable to me in training me as a young historian. And by the way, that university is the sitting in, Montgomery, which is considered, the home of the civil rights movement, is where Martin Luther King really cut his teeth into, as far as getting into the civil rights movement. And Alabama State University was at the heart of quite a bit of that.
Mhm. Okay, I understand that you also came in contact with or with the work of Hayford.
Casely Hayford.
Yeah,
Yeah, Casely.
can you talk more about that?
Oh, Casely Hayford. So when I was in grad school, I was given this little book called Ethiopia Unbound, published in 1911, I believe. And in Ethiopia Unbound, Casely Hayford, who was a lawyer from Ghana, he talked about quite a few things. It was during a time where people were referring to each other almost as if we, in a positive way, referred to each other as Black people or as African people. It was another term that was being used in that time, which was Ethiopian. So, hey, Ethiopian, that kind of thing was happening, and it was largely because of the the politics at the time, where Ethiopia had defended itself against Mussolini's invading forces, and continued to be, at least in the modern era, the only African country who had, that had not been colonized. I mean, you can make arguments for Liberia, but that's a different conversation. But anyway, and so people, had great pride in Ethiopia because of that, and the passage in the Bible, princes of Ethiopia, or princes of Egypt, and then something like Ethiopia should stretch forth his hands towards God. And so it had great religious pride, and racial pride, and so racial religious, type of connotation that was happening as it involved Ethiopia. So I say all that to say that this guy, Casely Hayford, he's reading and writing about people of, throughout the African continent, throughout the African diaspora, and he comes across Du Bois as the soul of Black folk. And he gives a very scathing critique of double consciousness. And this is in 1911. Soul of Black folk had been out maybe somewhere around 10 years by that time, maybe a little less than 10 years, actually. And so, basically, he was saying that double consciousness was, really not worthy of a concept to be considered. And he only thinks of that way because of the setting that he's in. And I think Casely Hayford, if I was interpreting it right, was largely saying you can't have two consciousness. Says, you either are for the African world, or you're for, the Ethiopian world in his language, or you're not, you're for the European world or whatever have you. And so it was very influential on my thinking, coming across Casely Hayford's book.
That's interesting. I see. This is what I really like to learn about. No, we are talking of 1911 now. Talking of writings that become interesting to young African who will become, of course, pioneer in African history. So the question usually that I like to ask is, where are they getting the information? Where are they getting the acceptance or the opposition to the point that they are standing on? I'm really blind to whatever the European is saying. I'm not interested. I'm interested in what the Africans are saying. Like, which other Africans were writing, were contesting what they are saying, or were in agreement, but on the basis of what were they in agreement. And so that I'm saying that because I want to tell the people that are listening to us, particularly the younger Africans that are listening to us, that there are materials out there that they can go there and find out for themselves. Like the one you just made mention of now. Somebody that I've listened to us can say, okay, let me go and find out, is that book still in existence? Maybe the book is not in existence anymore. Why not? We can republish it again because we want our story to be there. So, like in the case of Casey Hesford, are there other maybe people like that that could have influenced, or maybe in the time of the boys that could have either contested or influencing or support him that we might know of?
There were quite a few individuals. There was um, Blyden, Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was quite similar to Cramel. Then there was people like Henry Highland Garnett. There was David Walker. There was Martin Delaney. All of them approached the idea of Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, repatriation to Africa. They all approached it from different points of view, but this conversation was happening, and they were writing about it, and it was, there was powerful things happening at that time in the United States, and throughout the world too. But Henry Highland Garnett, this during the period of enslavement, and he's saying, hereditary bondsmen, if you wish to be free, you must first strike the blow, and essentially saying that no one's going to give power to you. You're going to have to, drop these chains yourself and seize power for yourself and seize freedom for yourself. And that's a very, whether people understand it to be or not, that was a very Black nationalist idea as well. At least I view it as that way. Because largely what, Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism was in that time, even though there's some, precursory elements, but the paradigm of what we consider those two phrases or those two terms today was in response to what was happening to people of African descent throughout the African world, by way of colonialism, imperialism, enslavement, and whatever have you. A response that was saying that we need to band together, and the only way to get freedom and the only way to have autonomy or some sense of sovereignty, even if we can achieve that, is to band together, work together, and come together on racial, social, political, cultural ties. And so yeah, there was quite a few people at that time that wrote things and that spoke very heavily about the things that Du Bois was talking about too.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely were some influences, I would imagine, on him, at least in some way.
What about the level of acceptance? Because I don't want to believe that everybody was in agreement with him. So, how was his work accepted in the community, in the African diaspora community, or let's say in the African American community, for example, in this case? For example, what was his kind of? How would you describe his relationship with Carnegie Wilson? I think that would be important, no?
Du Bois and Woodson had an interesting relationship. I often tell people that we don't pay enough attention to the relationship between Du Bois and Woodson juxtaposed to the relationship between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and then sometimes people do pay attention to the relationship between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. And all of these relationships were relationships at all times in a positive sense, especially, he and Garvey. There were correspondences that, could be quite ugly sometimes. But Booker T. Washington, I don't think it ever really got ugly with him, but with Garvey, certainly. And then with Carter G. Woodson, who, by the way, Du Bois would be the first person of African descent to get a PhD in PhD in history from Harvard. Carter G. Woodson would be the second. And both of them focused heavily on African American and African history. And by the 30s and 40s, 20s and 30s, going into the 40s as well. By this time, Woodson and Du Bois had positioned themselves as, kind of the premier thinkers as it came to African American history, and Du Bois, of course, even more so. But there was a foundation, the Phelps-Stokes, I believe it was called, foundation, that was wanted to sponsor the creation of encyclopedia on Negro history, quote unquote. So, or not necessarily on Negro history, but encyclopedia of African Americans, or Negro encyclopedia at that time. And so there was a call sent out. The first one did not include Du Bois nor Woodson, very strangely. But people who came together in the first meeting for this encyclopedia, so Encyclopedia of the Negro, I believe it was called, actually, who came together in the first meeting, they said, these two people must be here. Why aren't they here? And so then in the second call, Woodson and Du Bois were reached out to. Du Bois responded to it. And Woodson had, by this time, had become fed up with white philanthropy, right? He felt that it was always serving their interests more than the interests of people of African descent, of course, and that it would give them continued sway over how African American history is presented, and continue power and control. Woodson, even though he himself was still receiving some, outside funding, from what I recall, but he was largely being self-funded, and particularly at this time in the 30s. I believe this was sometime in the early to mid 30s. And so he was largely being self-funded, and so he didn't answer the call. Du Bois did. Du Bois then said, okay, Woodson needs to be here. So he sends an email. He sends a letter to Woodson, and he says, hey, I know that you were offended that you weren't called the first time. I was offended too, but I'm here not because of the philanthropists who want to create this journal, but the people who came together and formed the board of this encyclopedia, and they saw the need for us to be here. Woodson responds, I would not essentially be caught dead working in the ranks of Phelps-Stokes and his and I could be mixing up how his name is pronounced, but in his ilk, basically. I won't be caught doing that. I refuse. This is just against me, because they are the enemy, essentially. And then he goes on to say, I do not accept the gifts of the Greeks. He tells Du Bois this: I do not accept the gifts of the Greeks. Sorry. And so Du Bois writes back and said, well, my good fellow, yes, they are the enemy, but the enemy has the money, and either they're going to use it for their own means, or they're going to give it to us to be used the way it should be used. And this was not a happy relationship, or happy correspondence between the two of them necessarily. And quite later on, by I think 38 or so, Carter G. Woodson was speaking out negatively of Du Bois and the whole Encyclopedia of the Negro project in general.
Thank you for sharing that. That's important. But was there any line of division that actually separated the two in terms of how they approach African American history, or African diaspora history, or African history in general, in terms of how they treated the history, how they preached it, how they presented it, that we could say this was different? If you take up a book to read, you say, okay, this is the line of thought of Du Bois, this is the line of thought of Carter G. Woodson. Was there anything like that, or was it just a question of personality?
Yeah. I mean, definitely. Woodson, his most famous book, which is a very small book, and in my estimation, perhaps a just a chip of a larger work called The Education of the Negro. But the famous one is called The Miseducation of the Negro. And in Woodson, in that book, he very clearly states the necessity for African Americans to have a greater understanding of African history, right? And to be orientating themselves and their educational socialization, really, by way of African history, instead of that of what he called the Teuton, which were or people of Germanic background, right? So instead of that of the Teuton, people of African descent should be looking at what are African stories, what are African backgrounds, and African language and things of that nature, and in orientating ourselves that way. And he even admonished historically Black universities, colleges, and universities for not doing that, for having classes full of Latin and some Greek and all these political histories of the Western world, but nothing on the history of people of African descent at all. So Woodson was very significant in that way. Du Bois Du Bois was known to have very flowery writing sometimes. So sometimes you knew Du Bois's work from, just how that was, but he was a very strong analyst. I mean, as a matter of fact, um, there's a growing, number of people who want to consider him as one of the fathers of American sociology, as one of them, because, here's Du Bois doing the first true sociological work on African Americans back in the early 20th century, called The Philadelphia Negro. And then several works of his after that is full of that type of analysis. And so definitely, in the way Du Bois writes, it's clearly, a bit unique, the way he writes, but his politics definitely developed over time from one of somewhat opponent, a person who agreed with integration, not assimilationist politics, but integration in the degree of, and I say just somewhat, in the degree of how African Americans should be accepted in American society. But his writings, even very early on, wasn't about assimilating, and it wasn't about African Americans losing their who they were as a people. He was very clear, perhaps also because the influence he was receiving from Alexander Crummell and others. He was very clear that there's a soul of Black folk that should be preserved, and that the culture of people of African descent in the Americas should be preserved, and something that should be valued, and that America has, and the Western world in general, has a lot to learn from African Americans. So a lot of this is Du Bois, but by the time of his writing of The World in Africa, because part of that conversation of the world has a lot to learn from the Negro and America has a lot to learn from the Negro, is that he says that the Negro has a lot to learn from America. But by the time The World in Africa comes out and he publishes that, he starts talking about the pattern of human culture, quote unquote. That's what he said, the pattern of human culture that has led the world to ruin, right? And he literally calls himself an African. He says, I'm writing a history of Africa from the African point of view. And but before he gets into the history, the very first chapter, he's talking about the collapse of Europe. and the next chapter is the white masters of the world. And he's talking about this pattern of human culture. And clearly at this time, he's not thinking that the West or even America specifically has so much to teach the world. Perhaps any nation that you would consider a European nation to some degree, Russia is the only one that he was really at this time kind of looking at as maybe some type of model in a political sense. But yeah, he definitely had advanced in his thinking, progressed in his thinking, and wanted the African world by this time to have more autonomy over themselves. He even wrote and lamented, actually it was in a speech where he lamented how at one time in his younger days he believed that the African Americans would come to Africa and help save the people of Africa and uplift them and bring them into development and all this kind of things. And he realized, and he says he regrets thinking that way. He realizes the great folly in it, how we've all essentially been colonized and brainwashed to some degree. But even at that time, Du Bois still had a few problematic things going on with him, Eurocentrically. But definitely, there's very unique things you could point out about the two of them.
Okay, now we see Du Bois writing about what he called the history of Africa. That is interesting. Now, in your research of Du Bois, your finding of him, do you find him going to Africa to maybe consult with some people there, I don't know, to study or to talk, to meet him, conferences, to gather information about the African people that he is now writing about as the history of Africa? Please share with us anything you know about that.
Well, Du Bois, at some point, becomes well, let me back up. Du Bois, in 1900, the year 1900, he attends the Pan-African Conference that was hosted by Henry Sylvester Williams, who was a lawyer from Trinidad who moved to Canada and actually became one of the founders of a Black Hockey League in Canada that created innovations like the slap shot and other things, but that's a whole other conversation. But Williams ends up in Europe and then sets up the 1900 Pan-African Conference, and Du Bois goes there to I'm getting the place wrong probably, but I believe it was Manchester, but I could be very wrong on that. But he visits the conference. Actually, it might have been Paris. Now that I think about it, but he visits the conference, and he is influenced, by this this Pan-African Conference. In 1919, Du Bois himself decides to hold a similar thing, but he named it a Congress, Pan-African Congress. And so he invited people from all over the African world, and several delegates from the African continent who were probably living in Paris at the time attended. And so he's being influenced by people coming from the continent, but I don't really recall. I remember something about a boat ride, but I don't really recall his first trip to the continent and where he went, other than maybe if it was Ghana. But I know he ended up traveling to Ghana, ended up dying in Ghana, actually. And he was very much associated with Kwame Nkrumah. And Nkrumah, who was someone who had traveled to America and attended Lincoln University and a historically Black college, used to, travel to Harlem, worked in Harlem to some degree. and certainly had to have come across Du Bois at that time. I can't exactly recall, but I do know that Nkrumah started going to the Pan-African Congresses, and he became somewhat of a mentee to some degree of Du Bois. And this is all before, of course, he became the first president of Ghana. So, so Du Bois, certainly had, quite a bit of relationships with people from the African continent, and visited the continent, at least, Ghana specifically. Another person that influenced Du Bois was Franz Boas, and it wasn't a huge influence on Du Bois's life necessarily, but what ended up happening, he was a visiting scholar at Atlanta University when Du Bois was teaching there. And Boas came and he taught the history of the so-called Black Sudan. So he did a one-day seminar on this, and it blew Du Bois away. And he was so inspired by this that he decided to delve further himself into African history. Another person is someone I believe I've already named, which was Henry Sylvester Williams, who started the first Pan-African conference, and Du Bois attended that conference in the year 1900.
Yeah, okay, I'm not going to go more on that because, of course, maybe in another conversation we could go more on that because
let me say that.
Yeah, please.
No, I was just saying, let me say that I might have lost your question somewhere in there, so I just want to make sure that I got everything that you were looking
No,
for.
you got it correctly.
Yeah,
No, you responded to it, like I said, just that, when you are talking, you bring out other argument that need further clarification and all that. But yeah, the question I asked you, you answered it. That was correct. Okay. In that, yeah, you responded to it. But I was saying that because I wanted to expand on that, in that I'm so much in favor of the idea that between the African diaspora and the Africans in Africa, there need to be a stronger connection, a stronger collaboration for us to be able to forge our destiny, because we are connected by the same destiny. We are going to the same direction. We are the same people, and we are suffering from the same crime. We have the same enemy, so we should be able to also build ourselves together.
I don't know. I mean, the book itself, I'll say this: the book itself is largely a critique on Du Bois's thinking as he approached African history, and now there's of course some praise, quite a bit of praise for the great achievement the book was for the year in which it was published and all the resources that he had available to him. And but of course it's W.B. Du Bois. You can't expect anything less from someone like him. But there's things that Du Bois does, and I kind of hinted to it previously. There's one thing I talk about in the book called the Andromeda complex, which Du Bois, he relates the history of Andromeda, who was a Greek goddess, but you could say an Ethiopian quote unquote goddess from the Greek perspective, although there's almost no images of Andromeda looking Ethiopian. She looks like like she's Greek, and then her attendants all have Ethiopian features. But and he talks about how Perseus basically saves Andromeda from a sea monster, and he makes this analogy for African Americans or people of African descent in the Western world to come and save Africa. That Africa is like Andromeda and needs saving, and I found a lot of issue with that, of course, because of course the way he's approaching this notion of saving. Now, I don't have issue with banding together with people throughout the African continent to save the people and the countries thereof and the cultures and all this. But when it comes to this notion of you have to use Western education and Western socialization and all these kind of things to help save Africa, Western politics, democracy is what's going to save Africa. instead of investigating what were the African governance of living pre-colonially, and how how do you restore that? You can save it in those ways with consideration for what the Western world and the rest of the world is doing. And I make this kind of analogy with the Meiji Restoration. I think I'm butchering that name, but I think the Meiji Restoration in Japan, where which happened in the year of Du Bois's birth, actually, where they incorporated the samurai, reinstated the shogunate, and they incorporated a lot of Western ideas into the governance of Japan, but did not eradicate their own indigenous ways of governance. They just wanted to kind of prepare themselves for what was going on in the world around them, and have an understanding of Western politics and things of that nature, because they're seeing that China is being has been given some hell by Britain and other powers, and they are now, Japan is now being encroached upon as well. And so, but they did not lose their, national political culture necessarily. There was, some degree of pluralism that occurred there. And I said that, the same could have been done as it came to Africa, only for the sake of making sure that not only are, indigenous epistemological foundations preserved, but they are able to contend with what's going on the world stage. And that's much different from Du Bois, almost in a way wholesale saying that democracy is and these Western Western forms of governance and Western forms of anything is what's going to save Africa.
Thank you for that. I like that. I like that. I think even the idea itself of salvation is something that we need to talk about on a topic of its own. We really need to examine it, what it really means. Mm-hmm. But as an African, as an individual African, I'm not speaking for all the African people. I don't think anybody is going to save Africa from the outside. It is not logical that you leave your house to go and save a people. How do you do that? How do you do that? It is not possible. The only people that can save Africa are going to be the African people. So the idea that Jesus is going to save Africa is a hoax. It's not true. The idea that Muhammad is coming to save Africa, it is not possible. If there is any people or any ideology that is going to save Africa, it's going to come from the African people and through their system. That is the only salvation that is going to happen. It's not going to be through a conference, maybe a conference that is going to be held in Berlin or in Germany or in France or in Washington can influence. But it takes more than that to save Africa. In fact, the idea itself of saving Africa, I don't know if it's really going to work in the African linguistic. Anyway, that is by the way. How can people find your book?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, any of the major book retailers, or you can go on Anthem Press's website and purchase it there.
Thank you so much for that. So in 1 minute, what would be your final thought here in 1 minute?
So the thing I say about Du Bois is he's a significant person in history, particularly because of how long he lived and how, just how long he was writing about people of African descent. And so this is someone who was born just 3 years after the end of the Civil War in America, and then was, somewhat a contemporary of people like Frederick Douglass, and then died the night before the March on Washington. So someone who is a contemporary of Douglass and is someone who's looked at as a significant figure and is looked up to by people like Martin Luther King, and to put Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King in the same time period, even, in terms of someone's life, is pretty, astounding to think about if for those who knows history. And so in fact, he was so significant to African American community that David Levering Lewis states in his biography on Du Bois that the morning of the March on Washington, Du Bois had died the night before. And the rumor that was going around was that he had died. But instead of people saying, "Did you hear Du Bois died?" it was, "Did you hear the old man died?" And everyone knew who that was. So he was very well respected. And so Du Bois will, always be kind of paradigmatic in history, but and particularly for African Americans and for the African world because of his work on Pan-Africanism. But what I always try to stress is that what the Western Academy generally focuses on when it comes to Du Bois is his earlier works on, things like the talented tenth and double consciousness, something that, as far as I can tell, double consciousness published twice, but only really penned once in his whole career. He didn't really develop it, in my estimation, into a theory, or at least not intentionally. It was others who came after him who wanted to. But by the time of Du Bois's death, he had moved way far away from this notion of double consciousness. He was very much concerned about the state of the African world, and to me, a much more significant concept and something that would, honor him in the totality of his life. If you look at his writings on Pan-Africanism and this, what I say really was his theoretical basis near the end of his life, Pan-Africa, when he talked about a Pan-Africa to Kwame Nkrumah and others through his letters and his theorizing in his speeches and things of that nature on Pan-Africa. One concept I talk about in the book is something I named the Eurocentric masquerade. And this is something I actually got from Malefikete Asante's, many of his books on Afrocentricity, and particularly his book, The Afrocentric Manifesto. And the way this worked, the Eurocentric masquerade, is essentially that the Western world, by way of imperialism, colonialism, enslavement, and any other ism that you could think of that involves domination, has effectively established this notion of a universal humanity, that there are universal standards by which people should operate. So a universal human paradigm that you should exist on or exist from. And what this has done is caused other groups of people, particularly those who have been dominated, to develop some sense of self-hatred. And it has caused them to be decentered culturally. So to the degree that they will view their own culture as something that is less than, or something that is even evil or demonic, juxtaposed to that of Western culture and Western history, Western religion, and things of that nature. So with the Eurocentric masquerade, it's essentially just that. It's a masquerade. It's not true. This universal humanism, it's something that the West has simply put forward. And there are some groups who didn't fall into that trap, at least not completely, such as I mentioned Japan in the book, and how during the late 19th century, they adopted some Western political and other, just forms of Westernization. They adopted it, but they did not wholesale recreate their culture or wholesale replace their cultural paradigm with Western cultural paradigms. They simply supplemented because of the need to contend with the West and to understand the geopolitics of the West. And so that was them not really falling into the Eurocentric masquerade. There's not this veiled universalism that they adhere to as it comes to who they believe themselves to be as a people. But that's a problem that exists throughout the African continent and throughout the African world that must be addressed, must be fixed. And people are doing that work through decolonial scholarship and especially through Afrocentric scholarship.
Thank you so much, brother. This has really been an interesting conversation. And of course, to our viewer, to our listeners, those who are going to be listening in audio, it's an important book that you need to check out, and it's available on Amazon. Read it, and of course, share it with Professor here what you have learned about it, because it is important. We are also trying to hear from you what you think, because your opinion is important. He have taken the time to study this important personality, and he have put his work out there. So it is your turn. Read and share also what you think about it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and the contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.